thanks very much to Jeff and Melissa and everyone who's been involved in organising the event. From my perspective, this is really a great opportunity to share the work that we've been doing and are still doing. We're really right in the thick of this project now. It's by no means finished, but we've got some things to tell you about where we've got to. I hope you'll get excited about where we're heading. And the two of us will be presenting different but complementary talks in a way. Mine sort of sets a big picture, and then Syed is dealing with one of the most important parts of that big picture. Okay, so the background of this is that as Jeff's just basically said, we need to be able to prioritise our investments in water-sensitive water projects generally, water-related issues generally, and people need to be able to present convincing business cases in order to secure funding, and those two things are obviously closely related. And so I'm part of a large national centre called the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities. This has been going already for a few years, and it ran for one phase of research, then it sort of took a breath and said, well, what are we going to do next? Did lots of consultation around Australia about what the next projects should be. And this issue around economics of water and water in urban areas was the thing that I think it was second top in the ranking of the things that the people wanted most. So it's obviously something that has generated a lot of interest, not just in South Australia, but around Australia. And they said, we'd like some help with this, we'd like some more information, but we'd also like some tools that we can use in our daily business to help us with this really challenging area. So that's what we've been tasked with. So you're going to hear about two tools today. The first one on that list is the one that Syed will talk about. So it's a tool to provide defensible estimates of the monetary equivalent value of non-monetary benefits. So that could be social or environmental benefits. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on in my talk, but that'll be the whole focus of Syed's talk. And the other tool people were looking for was a standardised tool for conducting benefit cost analysis to pull all the information together in an integrated way, as Jeff was just saying, to be able to make an all things considered assessment of whether particular investments are worthwhile and how different investments stack up relative to each other. So that's the ambit. There's actually some other bits as well. We're not going to talk about another part of the project, which goes to the last part of Jeff's comments about coordination. We're looking at, in one of our projects, how we can incentivise and organise situations where the benefits are captured by somebody but the costs are borne by somebody else. So a very common problem in the sector. So that's another part of the project which hasn't started yet, but will be something that we work on starting later this year and into next year. Now, benefit cost analysis, as I said, we're in the Cooperative Research Centre, I'll probably just call it the CRC. We have been doing some work already, and in the first phase, one of the things we did was produce this report, which isn't exactly about benefit cost analysis, but it's somewhat related. So this is a freely available report called Ranking Projects for Water Sensitive Cities, a Practical Guide. You can get it off the CRC website. It's about, I guess it's in a sense it's a guide for how to do very simple, quick and dirty benefit cost analyses of a large number of project options and then rank them. It's about the principles and some practical advice on how to go about doing that. And it's quite, as I say, it's quite practical and includes spreadsheet templates and guidelines that are really get you to quite a hands-on level of use, but it's also theoretically respectable. It's got lots of sort of things in there that economists worry about getting right, some of which I'm going to talk about today. So that was really sort of the first sort of step we took towards this benefit cost analysis tool that we're now developing. So that's sort of one dot on the map. And as I've just said, part of what's gone into the design of that set of guidelines is my knowledge of economic theory and my colleagues' knowledge of economic theory. So we wanted to do something that was practical but respectable, because we've got to get it past Departments of Treasury and they'll be looking to make sure we tick all the right boxes and we've done our economic analysis in a defensible way. Another tool that I had previously developed is this thing called Infer. Some of you may have had some exposure to it. It's called the Investment Framework for Environmental Resources. It's been around for close to a decade now. It's more been designed for use in the natural resource management sector, so the regional NRM bodies A number of them have used this as a tool for planning in programs like Caring for Our Country, and now it's called the National Land Care Program. So we had some experience in a somewhat related tool. Using that tool, I've done hundreds of benefit cost analyses of environmental projects in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Italy. So lots of experience there to draw on. So all of this is sort of helping us shape what a tool could look like. That experience informed what was in the guidelines as well, that I've already told you about. The other thing that's shaped this project and the design of this benefit cost analysis tool is all the consultation that we did in the lead-up phase to creating the project. That consultation process went for about a year, involved hundreds of people, many different organisations, lots of people giving their opinions on what the priorities should be, what the needs were. So all of that was captured and digested and went into the specific design for this project. In addition, once we really got going in earnest in the project, we did even more detailed consultation with a range of stakeholders. I did personal interviews with quite a few people in a range of different agencies, ranging from small local governments to big state departments and water utilities, private consultants, economists, to get their perspective on what might be needed, what might be good or bad in a benefit cost analysis tool for this sector. And then the other thing we did was review a range of existing tools. There are already a number of tools out there, and so we didn't just want to reinvent the wheel unless the wheel was already there and was good enough. And so you'll hear a little bit later about what we did there, but looked at all the existing options and tried to learn from the good and the bad in what was already out there. And so all of that fed into a set of proposed specs for this BCA tool, which we sent to our steering committee. We have a national steering committee with people from all over the country, including Melissa, who reviewed that quite seriously, quite intensely, gave us a lot of feedback, and so we ended up with a set of agreed specs for the tool, and we're now in the process of actually implementing it. So I'm working now on creating a beta version of this tool. Once we have that, we will apply it in some case studies. We'll have other people using it. We'll have some user feedback again, and then we will eventually, later this year, release a public version of the tool, and then we'll be in a loop of feedback, further revisions over time. So I don't see this as something that we'll do and then stop. I think this is an ongoing project for as long as we can get resources to do it. We'll keep caring for this tool and producing versions and updates that people need. And that line says about where we are now. We're sort of in the middle of actually creating the beta version. Right, so what I'm going to do now is talk about most of those boxes. What's in each of those boxes to give you an idea of why we're doing and exactly, particularly what we're doing for this particular tool. And I'll start with the bit that you might think is the most boring, but I'll present it in a way where you can really see the relevance of this to the tool. So a bit of basic economic theory. I know there are actually some economists in the room who will probably go to sleep in the course of this, but I'm pitching it to people who don't have economics as a strength and are interested to see, well, what is it that economists think about and worry about when they're putting together a tool like this. So, few essential bits and pieces that economists would just reject out of a tool that didn't have these out of hand. The first is we need to be really clear about the with versus the without for the things that we are evaluating. So we're looking at potentially funding a project. So what would have happened with the project, and the point of comparison is what would have happened without the project. And the benefits of the project are the difference between the good things with the project and the good things without the project. So the benefits of a project are based on a comparison of outcomes with the project versus without the project. And specifically, they're not a comparison before the project versus after the project, which is what many tools, many sort of evaluation systems actually do. They do a before versus after comparison. And the problem with that is that things can change. So it's quite possible that once you've set a project in train, what would have happened without the project is that conditions would have continued to worsen, and as a result of the project you hope things can get better. And so the comparison you want to make after a certain point in time, this is 10 years into a project, is, this is some measure of the benefits of the project, is the difference between with the project versus without the project. And you need to be able to do that for each year subsequent to the project starting, and in some way aggregate those up to get an overall measure of the benefits. So that's one possible outcome. Another outcome, another reason you need to worry about this, is that actually things could get better without the project. And so if you anticipate that things will improve with the project, you've got to worry about, okay, but would they have got better anyway, even without the project? And sometimes that's true. So here's a scenario where it looks like things have got better. In fact, that shape's exactly the same as that. But without the project, things would have improved as well, just not quite as much. So in this case, the benefit is only the vertical distance between those two lines, not very much at all. The other reason you need to worry about it is that once you consider the with versus without story, there can be benefits in a project even if conditions get worse, because without the project they would have got even worse. Okay, so that's the without the project story. Here's what you get with the project. Okay, it's sort of falling over time, but there's still a benefit relative to what you would have had without the project. So that's a really critical aspect of the story to get right. And it might seem like common sense, it should be common sense, but it's amazing how many times people get this wrong. People meaning non-economists. I've just said economists are not people, I think. And so, for example, there was a review done recently of a set of 16 planning tools in the conservation area, all developed by non-economists. 15 of the 16 got this aspect wrong. And so, effectively, the benefits they were measuring were pretty random. You know, who knows what they were comparing the benefits to. So we need to be clear about, it's just as important to define the business as usual scenario as the project scenario, because all your investment options are going to be compared to that business as usual scenario. That adds to your uncertainties and challenge, because both the with and without project scenarios are predictions in a situation where we're trying to make decisions about what we'll do. Both aspects of this are predictions, and so there's uncertainty about both sides of the equation. So that's a challenge. I'll talk more about uncertainty later. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, I think. Okay, so the next issue is about time. We worry a lot about time in economics because in many projects the benefits occur sometime, and sometimes a long time, after when you incur the costs. So for example, here's a series of pictures from a stream restoration project in a suburb of Perth. So back in the 60s it was an agricultural paddock, but it had this sort of more or less semi-natural stream. And then it was developed into an urban development, and it was a straight drain. And then in 2000 and 2001, a decision was made to restore it to something a bit more natural. You can see they made it a bit wiggly. They started to restore vegetation. 2010, it was back to being something quite nice. So there's at least a 10-year gap between the decision and when the benefits actually occur. And in fact, it's worse than that, because not only is there a delay between when the investment occurs and when the benefits arise. Sorry, this is time. This is zero, and if it's above the line, that means the project is generating a benefit. If it's below the line, it means that the project is actually making things worse for the local community. This is not the costs of the project in terms of the financial cost. This is like a disutility, a disamenity in that area. So with all the tractors and the site works going on in there and the thing looking worse and the noise maybe, it actually got worse until sometime later the benefits became positive. So Syed's going to talk a bit more about this example later on in his talk in a bit more detail about how you would estimate this. I'm not talking about how you estimate it. And so this is a very common pattern in economic analysis of all sorts of things, that you have a big cost up the front, then not much happens, and then eventually you sort of hope to get some benefits in the future. Very typical. And it could just be because it takes a while for trees to grow, if trees are involved in the project, but it could be because it takes a while for the groundwater to move through the soil and do what it has to do. So time is a big issue. So how do you, our concern is, well, how do you compare the costs in year 1 or year 1 to 5 with benefits that could be 10, 20, even more years in the future? And the problem is that we need to account for something approximating interest. So economists have a number of reasons why we worry about this, but the one that's easiest to think about and understand is this sort of interest story. We need to account for the fact that these upfront costs effectively incur an interest cost. You think about it that you're sort of borrowing the money, even if you're not borrowing it, it's coming from somewhere and it'll incur effectively an interest cost. And that will accumulate over time. So there'll be interest on upfront costs, and then that builds up. So if you're looking sort of sometime in the future, you also need to allow not just for the upfront costs, but for the interest costs, and they both have to exceed the benefits. So we also need to allow for interest on the benefits that occur early on. So if you get some benefits up front, they might also generate effectively interest. So if we said what we want to do is get the project that has the best benefits in year 20, what you could do is just sort of compound these interest, benefits and costs over time, add on the actual benefits and costs that occur in those years and add them all up and do a sort of a sum at year 20 and ask the question, are the total benefits, including the interest on the earlier benefits, enough to outweigh the total costs, including the interest costs? So that's a sort of a fairly simple, common sense way to think about it. Just to confuse matters, the way that economists usually do it is we don't sort of look forward to year 20 or 30. We like to compare things in the present. So what we actually do is we incur interest backwards from the future to the present. So you sort of discount things back and do a comparison in the present time. So what we're interested in is, are the present value of benefits greater than the present value of costs, and how much greater are they? So that's the story with time. So any economic tool has to deal with this issue very well and has to account for timing. The next thing we want to worry about is actually quantifying the benefits. And some of those are hard and some of those are a bit easier. The relatively easy ones are around the market benefits. So some things we want to value are bought and sold in markets. They have a price. We can look at how that price changes under different situations if supply or demand changes. And so if we know that, then using pretty standard economic tools that anyone who's done Economics 100 at school or at uni or done economics at high school would be familiar with the simple supply and demand graphs. And so I'm not going to explain how they work, but if that's your supply curve and that's your demand curve, then the total benefits is this dark blue area. And if you put in a subsidy for shower heads and you move the demand curve out, the paler blue area becomes your benefits. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it doesn't matter. All you need to know is we've got tools to do this that are well founded, they work well, they're theoretically respectable, and we can do that. More challenging is these non-market, unpriced benefits. So we would like, if possible, to quantify those in monetary equivalent terms to feed into our benefit cost analysis. And so economists have developed a range of quite clever tools to do that, and Syed will talk about those. But the sorts of things you would try to capture in this is things like ecological improvements, aesthetic benefits, recreation, health, thermal comfort. So some things we could do with lower temperature in summer, so that'd be nice. And that's the things that Syed will talk about. Third type of benefit that's relevant in the water sector is some of the projects we do could contribute to a reduction and or a delay in the costs of infrastructure. So if it's possible to defer or prevent the investment in a water treatment plant, for example, we did some work in Victoria, and one of the benefits from some of the things we could do in a water catchment there was that we could avoid a treatment plant, maybe forever or maybe for 20 years. And so they were significant benefits. Even if it's just a delay, there's a significant benefit because of all the saved interest. It's all that interest I was talking about when I was talking about time. If you can delay a big cost for a long time, the benefit is almost as large as delaying it forever because of the way that compound interest works. Okay, so that's that one. And then the fourth one, the fourth main one that we'll capture is around reducing risks. So some projects that we might invest in, for example, could have a benefit in terms of reduced flood risk. If we're putting a lot of vegetation out in the community, maybe we're reducing concrete and bricks, we could reduce the probability of an adverse event like an urban flood. So we want to be able to capture that benefit. So there could be non-market and market benefits involved in that potentially, but they take a particular form. There's a reduction in the cost of an incident, and because we've reduced the probability of an incident. So we want to multiply those two things together, and it's what we're doing is we're taking the difference with and without the project again. And time could come into it because maybe with climate change, this risk is changing over time. So we would need to factor time into this risk. So this time, risk, benefits, the different types of benefits, they all interact and have to be brought together. You get a flavour of as Jeff referred to, there's a whole lot of stuff that has to be somehow stitched together in a coherent way. So all of those different types of benefits and a couple of others will be represented in the tool that we'll develop. So you'll be able to specify what the project is, what specific activities will be involved, and then we'll have to look at, well, what benefits, of all those different types of benefits, which ones are likely to flow from that particular set of actions, and what would have happened without the project so that we can take the difference. And the tool will be able to combine multiple benefits. We won't be looking at one particular type of benefit. We'll be saying, here's the list of benefit types. We'll identify the main ones, quantify those, monetize them, and join up the dots. Okay, so that gives you a bit of a sense of some of the economics thinking behind the design of the tool that we're developing. I want to talk now about a couple of issues from the extensive experience that we've had in applying tools a bit like this with a range of different end users, from governments to community groups to NGOs. The sorts of things that can go wrong and the sorts of things that you need to try and help people with in the way that you set up the tool to operate. So it's not just a matter of putting in a bunch of equations and say, give us your numbers. There's some tricks here and some pitfalls to try and avoid. One of those is the planning fallacy. So an amazing thing happened about 20 years ago. Economists and psychologists started to work together. And what's emerged from that is a new discipline called behavioural economics, which is studying in detail the biases that people tend to have in a whole range of different walks of life. Could just be in your private life, but also it could be in business or in government. And one of the really important ones that they identified, which in fact my group had observed, and we had our own name for it in fact, they've called the planning fallacy. And it's the observation that people, when they're developing a project, tend to get too optimistic about the likely success of that project, the likely benefits and the likely costs of a particular project. And they observe that this happens even if people are aware of the planning fallacy. They'll still do this. Even if they're trying to avoid the planning fallacy, they'll still do this. And I want to emphasise, it's not just people being strategic, right? That's another thing. People could sort of exaggerate the benefits because they want to pump up the benefits to get funding. It's not just that. It's people trying to be honest, but being unable to be, So it's really quite an interesting phenomenon. And it's really not uncommon when you go back and review a project that's been put together in a critical way, to find that the benefits have been exaggerated by 100% or more, and sometimes by a lot more. So for example, there was a review done of all railway projects around the world over a period of about 15 years, and they found that the average under-prediction of passenger use of the railways was 106%. Okay. And the other interesting thing was that through that 20-year period, the predictions didn't get any better. They observed these under-predictions and they kept predicting the same. So, over-predictions, I mean. Okay, but some projects are exaggerated more than others. So what can you do as part of this sort of tool? So into the tools that I've already developed, in Fur that I mentioned, and in this one, we'll try and embed some strategies to help people not fool themselves and not fool the decision makers, such as obvious things like common sense. Ask for evidence. You've given us these numbers. What's the basis for those numbers? Is there modelling? Is there research? Include some consistency checks. So, question 17. You've said this, but back in question 4 you said that. Are those two things consistent? So sometimes you can sort of catch people out, or they help them catch themselves out in illogical thinking about different parts of the puzzle. I think it's important, particularly for large projects, to have some sort of external person have a look at it to try and evaluate someone who knows what they're talking about, evaluate the numbers that have gone into an assessment. And the other thing is being explicit about project risks. One of the key things that people underestimate is what can go wrong in a project. They tend to just assume that once you put it in place, it'll all just happen. And that's not always true. And so to tease that out, what we do in my existing tool, and we'll do in this tool, is ask people to be explicit about the project risks. So these project risks are not the risks that we're trying to avoid with the project, like the flood risk. This is what could go wrong that would mean this project fails. It could be for technical reasons, socio-political reasons, financial reasons, managerial reasons. And we'll try and identify those explicitly, have some subjective quantification of those, and weight the overall results by the probability of success. My time is running away from me, so let me zoom along a bit. Uncertainty, I mentioned, is really important. Even with your best efforts to get the best available data, even if there's good research in the area, you can already see, I think, that trying to do something like this is quite demanding of data. There's many different sources of data that need to be brought together. There's bound to be uncertainty about some of the information that you need. So you need to be clear about how important that uncertainty is. So we ask our users to rate the quality of the data that's been used, identify particular numbers about which they're particularly uncertain, ask what they'll be doing about it. So just ask them, what will you do about the uncertainty? And the answer could be nothing, fair enough, but maybe you'll do some further research, maybe you can do a pilot test of the project before you implement it in full, maybe you could do some adaptive management. So we'll be providing some guidelines about different ways of handling uncertainty in a serious-minded way. I'm going to skip the setting targets. It's an important topic. And just give you a quick flavour of what we did with existing tools. So there's a bunch of existing tools. As I said, they're not all, the top little group here, you can't read the text, is existing BCA tools. Then some other related tools which don't do benefit costs exactly, but they're relevant to Saeed's part of the talk. And then a few other bits and pieces that provided guidance that we drew on. So we looked at a lot of different work that's already been done. The ones that are BCA tools tend to specialise in a particular aspect, like catchment projects or trees or water recycling or water quality, and they're not holistic in the way that we want this tool to be. So we at least convince ourselves that there's a gap in the market for something that's more holistic. And so, but in doing all that work to review them, we learned a lot. There's a lot of good ideas that we can take in, and a few flaws that we can try to avoid. And if you were interested, there is an existing report that gives that information. That one's not online publicly, but you can contact us if you're interested.
We'll circulate it.
Yeah. And then lastly, we did, as I've already emphasised, a lot of consultation. Just give you some snippets of what we took away, some of what we took away from the consultation, just to give you a flavour. So, as I started saying, every organisation that we talked to saw economics as important. Some of them already used BCA a lot, so they didn't really need us. And that's mostly the larger ones, the big utilities particularly, but not all of the utilities. Some of them didn't. Where they did use BCA, they tended to commission it externally, although, again, not always. There were some that did it internally. And the smaller organisations, like local governments, most of the local governments are small-ish, tended not to have much economics expertise internally, and so they were quite keen to have some help. Not quite sure what help they wanted, but they wanted to do more in the economic space. We talked to economists. That was interesting. Some of us told us not to bother. They said, don't do it. You shouldn't be doing this project. Some of them felt that there was risks putting economics tools in the hands of non-economists. So I can see what they're talking about. They prefer to do their own BCAs. But some others could say, no, this is a useful tool for us. We can see value in having a standardised tool across the sector. So I think this is my last slide. So amongst the smaller organisations, what we really identified is a need to build capacity. There was a possibly slightly unrealistic expectation that we would be able to deliver a really simple tool that anyone could just open up and use. And I hope you've got a flavour that actually it's just not a simple issue, right? There's a lot of expertise, some reasonable level of expertise needed before you're not dangerous in this space. But we are going to develop some training and some sort of BCA support tool or guidance, particularly targeted at the smaller organisations that lack expertise to help them become smarter purchasers of economics. That's it. So my target is to finish an initial version of the tool in March. We'll test it internally. Hope that we'll have something available to release to people by the end of April. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Now, David, if you can start here for a few questions as well. And Mel, you're going to be running around with a roving mic. So, I think obviously the focus on economics is really important. It's one of those key gaps that we see when we're trying to make investment decisions in this space. I think other than economic theory, I took out of that we can't be honest even with ourselves and that economists aren't people. So there's a couple of interesting insights there. So we're going to go with some questions from the floor, and please note as well that in the workshop session later on, we will be tackling the question of what type, as in scale and nature of projects, would you like to apply this tool to. So that's something that's coming. But does anyone have any questions for David to get things going?
Okay, Nadine Kilsby from the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Regions Natural Resource Management Board. What sort of format do you imagine this tool to come in? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Is it a flowchart? And then there's also, I guess, the other context is the local context. So house prices are different across the country, and the value of water and how water is valued is different in different places. So any thoughts on that?
First question is, initially at least, it will be as an Excel spreadsheet. We want it to be as flexible as possible because we expect to be making changes to it quite frequently in the early stages. In the long term, there's an option to implement it as a web-based system. The Infer tool I mentioned went through that pathway, started as an Excel tool, ended up as web-based, but we'll make that decision in consultation with our end users, which they prefer. So it could go either way. In terms of flexibility to local numbers and local conditions, that's absolutely fine, completely open. You can enter your own numbers in as needed.
I think that's a good one to comment on later on as well in the workshop. So one of the things we'll be looking at there is what support's required to make the tool more applicable, and even in whether it's an Excel-based or web-based. So that would be useful feedback later on. Do we have another question for David? You're going to get off easily.
I am. It's good.
Look, I might ask a question, which is around type and scale. So this is really a bit of a teaser for getting into the workshop setting. So do you have any view at the moment around the scale or nature of which this tool could be applied to for projects?
Okay, so it's a general enough tool that it could be used for any scale, from handkerchief to state, but in practice, there's probably a minimum scale that it's worth the effort. If it is too small a project, then some sort of more subjective, checklist type approach is probably, more sensible. Exactly where that scale lies is hard to say in terms of how do you measure scale? Scale value is not just about area, so it's a bit project specific. But the scale of benefits that you expect to generate need to be large enough that it's worth investing a bit of time in the data collection, the consultation, the learning, maybe even a bit of modelling or something if that's needed to actually invest in the tool.
Okay, great. I have to remember the handkerchief scale.
Yeah.
Nadine, you're doubling up here.
I can't resist. There's an opportunity to speak again. I guess my next question is, and I don't know if this was covered earlier properly, but who are we pitching this audience at? We often talk about benefit cost tools because we want, as practitioners who are already converted, to try and convert the non-converted. Or are you developing a tool that we can talk to your local civil engineer or your local minister for infrastructure that's not your minister for environment? I guess I know we can make something that we can understand as followers of WSID, but something that we can actually speak to others and say, here, I guess that's why we did it, but have we considered that, or have you considered that in the making?
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't put it in front of the minister, but, well, maybe you could. But I'd probably be doing, the work prior to getting, get your story straight, get your evidence together, and presenting a synthesised story to the minister based on the results, rather than actually putting it in their hands. So who are we presenting it to? So that's a good question, and it's. I think you may actually have a sense that I've struggled a bit with that through the consultation process because of the different expectations of different members of the audience. So we've got large organisations that have a particular role that they saw it being used for, perhaps putting it in the hands of their consultants to use, saying, we like this tool, you should use it to do your BCAs for us, through to a small local government that thinks we'd really like to do a quick and dirty thing for ourselves, or we'd like to at least be a smarter purchaser of this stuff. We'd like to, one of the things that I think we want to help those guys with is just making decisions about whether they actually should be doing a BCA. Is there even the data to do one, and what sorts of questions are they going to have to be answered to be able to do one? So it is a bit of a spectrum. The tool, I think, itself, the actual spreadsheet, obviously economists, and then other non-economists who are really willing to invest a bit of time into some training to become skilled enough not to be dangerous.
So the issue of audience as well is interesting. That I know from the stakeholder engagement work that's going to vary state to state as well. So you're trying to allow for different decision-making processes in different states. So if we're on Q&A, we'd now say it's time for the Twitter question or whatever Tony Jones says. So Catherine and Mel, what have we got coming through?
Okay, we've got 2 questions from the webinar participants.
Can I have them one at a time?
Yes. So how do you quantify post-project implementation impacts in the BCA, assuming there are some impacts just with implementation of the projects?
I don't understand the question.
Yeah. Maybe the next leading question might help put context. What would be the time frame for the assessment in the BCA tool following implementation of a project?
So it depends on what's relevant to a particular project. At the moment, we're setting it up with a maximum time frame of 50 years, but we could adjust that. It could be project specific. I would recommend for an organisation that's doing a series of these to standardise on some sort of time frame, maybe 20 years, 30 years, depending on the type of benefits. You could be evaluating projects where the benefits run out, in 10 years. But many of the things that we would invest in this space have much longer time frames than that. If you're implementing vegetation, you'd hope that would have benefits for a long time. Because we're discounting the benefits off into the future, there's probably not a lot of benefit in going much beyond 50 years. They start, the discounting tends to really kick in pretty hard after about 30. So that's why we've sort of gone to 50 at the moment. But
It sounds like it's going to vary project to project.
It could vary project to project if that makes sense. But for a particular organisation that wants to make the assessments comparable, I would, as much as possible, I'd recommend them standardising on the longest relevant time frame that's relevant to any of the projects that they're looking at.
I reckon we've got time for one more question. Have we got another one there, Mel?
We do, and then I'll go to the one on the floor. So the other webinar question is, how do you evaluate the regional benefits from a local project? Okay,
so now we're getting into the specifics of how you go to those, put up 4 different types of benefits. Then you've got to unpack how you do those. So that's a whole other story. It's easy to answer in principle. It's much harder to do it in reality. So in principle, you need to identify what are the flow-on effects from a particular local environment. So if you're doing a project high in a catchment and it's reducing, pollutants in the water body. I'm doing a project at the moment in Minnesota, and we're worried about pollution in the Gulf of Mexico, right? We're actually working on that now. So it's thousands of kilometres away. So you've got to have some way of quantifying that. And so the glib answer to that question is the best way you can in a reasonable time frame at a reasonable cost. And so that may be, if there's a suitable model, in this case there is in the Minnesota example, then we will actually be running models and trying to identify what difference it could make to the frequency of dead zones or the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. In an urban environment, depending on the type of benefits, it may be anything from a model, the results of some previous research, to get 4 experts in the room and ask them to argue until they can come up with a consensus.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, last question to Graham, and then we're going to go on to Sayed.
Graham Dandy from the University of Adelaide. This question's probably a bit from left field, but because the title of the seminar is benefit cost analysis, but there are other frameworks such as multi-criteria analysis that are used for ranking projects, used in the UK, for example, for ranking road projects. Did you consider other frameworks apart from the benefit cost framework?
So we were specifically asked to do a BCA, and some of the organisations that we consulted with already use MCA, multi-criteria analysis, and they wanted to, and they were, in certain circumstances, they were comfortable doing that, but they felt there was a need, in other cases, to go the extra step to the BCA. The difference being largely around quantifying in monetary equivalent terms the non-financial benefits. So we certainly are familiar, have seen them used, have used them, but this was a very specific set of driving instructions that we had. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, David. Can you join me again in thanking David for his presentation?